Hi there! Today we're going to be focusing on the theory of evolution and some of the individuals who worked on developing this theory. To do this, I'm going to tell you the story of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, Charles Darwin, Charles Lyell, Thomas Malthus, and Alfred Wallace. Once upon a time, there was a French naturalist named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who was one of the first theorists to make people start thinking about evolution. He noticed that all living things seemed to change over time and that they descended from a pre-existing species. Lamarck believed that animals needed to adapt to changes in their environment and that these adaptations could be inherited. From these observations, he came up with two principles for evolutionary change. The first one is called the law of use and disuse, and the second is inheritance of acquired characteristics. The law of use and disuse is the idea that organisms could modify parts of their body to better suit their environment. For example, giraffes needed long necks to reach leaves on high branches. So, according to Lamarck, the giraffes stretched their necks and modified them to make them longer and reach their food source. The law of inheritance of acquired traits is the idea that modifications made during an organism's lifetime will be passed on to their offspring. So if we think about our giraffe example again, if the giraffe stretches its neck and makes it longer, then this longer neck will be passed on to its offspring. To put this into perspective, if I had my arm amputated, the law of inheritance of acquired traits would say that my baby would be born with only one arm too, because this is a modification that happened during my lifetime, and therefore my offspring will also inherit this trait. With these kinds of examples, it is easier to understand that Lamarckism is wrong, but he did get the ball rolling for the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin is the most famous contributor to the theory of evolution, and you'll hear a lot about him in your other courses. Darwin was an English naturalist who went on a scientific research journey on the HMS Beagle from 1832 to 1836, when he was only 22 years old. His most significant observations occurred on the Galapagos Islands, where he noticed that the finches on these islands looked a lot like the finches he saw in South America, which was about 1,300 kilometers away. He found 13 different species on the island with different beak sizes and shapes, and realized that the different beak sizes and shapes was an adaptation to the food sources available on the various islands, such as seeds of different sizes and shapes and insects. These modifications were a product of evolution, and the finches became known as Darwin's finches. When he returned home to England in 1836, he was convinced that species evolved, but wasn't quite ready to write or publish his theory yet, so he spent more time researching and collecting data. We'll come back to Darwin in just a minute, but there are a couple other important researchers that contributed to Darwin's theories. While on the HMS Beagle, Darwin read The Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. In this paper, he learned about Lyell's idea of uniformitarianism, which strongly impacted his thinking. Uniformitarianism is the idea that the Earth is millions of years old, and the geological processes that we still see today have been occurring over this entire time. For example, erosion, which is the gradual destruction of something by wind, water, or other natural processes. Erosion can carve out canyons over large periods of time. These processes have been happening since ancient Earth, and there is physical evidence, so it can be assumed that Lyell is right. This led Darwin to think that if the Earth can change, maybe life can too, and that it takes a long time for these changes to happen. Thomas Malthus also contributed to Darwin's understanding of evolution. He wrote an essay on the principle of population, which Darwin read after he returned home from his journey on the Beagle. This helped develop his idea of natural selection, which we'll talk about in our next lesson, but Malthus argued in his paper that humans would use up the resources that we need to survive, so our growing population would be regulated by disease, war, and famine. So those three processes were going to keep our population number under control. Darwin realized that this applied to animal and plant species too, where nature would have to choose those that were most fit to survive, since the amount of food available cannot typically support an entire growing population. But we'll get into more detail on that later in the unit. While Darwin was conducting more research to support his ideas, Alfred Wallace arrived at similar conclusions on his own. He sent Darwin his ideas to discuss them, and when Darwin realized that other researchers were coming up with the same conclusions, this competition pushed him to publish his work. First, he published a joint paper with Wallace discussing both of their ideas, and then finally published his book on the origin of species in 1859, which covered years of research, analysis, and collected data. This book has been a huge success and changed the way that people thought about biology and evolution. While Darwin is the most famous theorist for his work, it is important to remember the other contributors that we've talked about today. And in our next lesson, we will discuss natural selection and descent with modification, which are two of Darwin's key concepts, as well as other evolutionary processes. Thank you so much for joining me today for the storytelling of the theory of evolution. I hope this gave you a solid background on the theory, and now we can dive into the specific concepts involved in evolution. See you next time.